Joining us now, Jonathan Conricus. He's a former spokesperson for IDF, now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's co-founder as well, of Bottom Line Media. Joining me now from Tel Aviv. Jonathan, good to have you back. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for having me. Shalom.
Can we conclude from this that the Israeli prime minister is not genuinely interested in negotiations at this point? Because we have seen similar attacks, although not quite as dramatic as this one, given it was a strike inside Doha, at other sensitive points in the negotiations.
No, I wouldn't be able to make that logical connection. My connection is, and what I think is happening is that Israel is, maybe 2 years too late or a year and a half too late, is finally bringing justice to terrorists. And these are not peaceful negotiators or politicians. These are Hamas terrorists with lots of blood on their hands who facilitated and made the October 7 murder and atrocities of Israelis possible through their dealings with Qatar, through financing and political support that they were able to gather in the region. And these are serious Hamas terrorists who currently were in the safe haven, what they thought was a safe haven. And what Israel is doing is just delivering justice to the terrorists who planned, and according to Israeli reports, including the hostage negotiations team, these Hamas foreign leaders were not conducive or positive in the negotiations, and they were actually obstructing and not applying pressure on Hamas to accept President Trump's proposal. And they were in the way of getting a deal done, a deal that I think Israel wants pretty desperately, instead of going on with the war and having to go in and conquer what's left of Gaza City.
Well, if that's true, then why would the U.S. president, who consistently backs Israel, make a point of saying publicly this was not his call? I mean, he said in that same statement, I'm paraphrasing, that the U.S. focuses on getting a deal done and getting hostages, some of whom are, as you know, U.S. nationals, home. Why that public daylight between the Israeli and U.S. leaders?
Jim, I read it a bit differently. And when I look at the military situation, Qatari airspace is defended by the United States of America. I find it extremely difficult to imagine that an attack of this magnitude, a strike in Doha, would be done by Israel, not just without approval, not just without telling the Americans, but actually having American high-level approval ahead of time. It's a heavily defended airspace with some of the best weapon systems in the world. I don't think this happened. This wasn't, a rogue Israeli action. And I would suggest everybody watching and thinking and assessing the situation here to remember what the global opinion was regarding negotiations with Iran by the U.S. before the war of the 12 days between Israel and Iran, and how surprised many were with what people, perhaps wishful thinking, thought that there was daylight between the U.S. and Israel. But then the Iranians were surprised, and many others were surprised that there really wasn't daylight. And I would suggest people do apply the same logic here. I think that the U.S. and Israel are communicating on the same wavelength here. I think that time ran out for Hamas terrorists in Gaza. I think that maybe, and this is totally my personal assessment, maybe the Qataris have not been delivering as President Trump expected them to deliver. I think President Trump has been very clear. I've been reading his messages. He wants the war in Gaza to end. He wants the suffering to end, and he wants the hostages home. Maybe he thought that the Qataris were not doing a good enough effort to apply pressure on Hamas to get that deal done. But that could also be a case, and maybe this could be a signal.
Does the Israeli prime minister want the war in Gaza to end? Because, as you know, some of his own former senior advisors question that. They say he wants to continue the war there with, perhaps, they say, his own interests at heart. And you have senior military leaders who've questioned the military function of continuing those operations there, and saying that a ceasefire and getting the hostages home should be the priority now. Does Netanyahu want to end the war in Gaza?
I don't know. I'm not affiliated with him. I'm not an advisor of his. What I think is, what we can judge are the actions. And so far, what I see is an Israeli prime minister that is ordering the military through the cabinet to defeat an enemy and win a war. And so far, that to me seems like the logical thing to do. My criticism is that it's taken too long time, and we should have had this done and dusted a while ago. But I think that, looking at it, if it hadn't been Israel, I think we would have been addressing the issue differently. But I think now we're moving in a right direction. What Israel is doing is trying to apply pressure, full court pressure on Hamas on the ground in Gaza, but now adding Doha, Qatar to the pressure here. And if you listen to Israeli messaging and what I think the clip that you had, the Israeli Prime Minister just a few minutes ago, Israel is saying, almost pleading with Hamas, take the deal, let's end the war, bring us our people back, and we can find a solution to the situation here because we do want to end the war. Israel is showing seriousness by placing forces there and preparing for a maneuver in Gaza, and now amplifying the pressure by hopefully taking out Hamas leadership, terrorists in Doha. But at the end of the day, if Hamas, what's left of Hamas's leadership, say, okay, we get it, and we understand that it's time to wrap, and they take a deal, the war would end very quickly.
Why then, in the midst of this, do you have Israeli officials pushing for annexing the West Bank? Is that going to help bring an end to the war in Gaza?
No, I don't think so. And I think that's more a response, kind of a angry response by Israeli legislators, also driven by Israeli popular opinion, to what I think are pretty reckless and naive statements made by important countries around the world, like France and the UK, Australia, Canada, saying that they're going to recognize the so-called Palestinian state. And I think that's the Israeli response to those statements, which I think those statements, if we speak about anything, they are very unhelpful. I think what they have done cumulatively is to embolden Hamas, to strengthen Hamas, and to make Hamas believe that they can actually stay around and fight it out here, and that they have global support, and that in September Israel is going to fold and they're going to get their way, both kill Israelis and launch October 7 attack, and then also get recognition as the armed faction that brought statehood to Palestinians, which is how this will go. If indeed there's a Palestinian state as a result, Hamas will be the victor. And Israel isn't going to let that happen, no matter how many important countries say and declare. And I think it's tragic that these countries have said so. And what you're seeing and referring to, I think, is much more an Israeli response, kind of angry response, more than really policy. The last week and a half, there have not been any meetings by the cabinet or headed by the prime minister on this topic. I would still classify it as declarative and not a real hardcore policy. But if the situation deteriorates and if European powers do different things, then maybe Israel will respond differently.
Well, not the first time it's been proposed, as you know. Jonathan Conricus, thanks for staying up late for us in Tel Aviv.
Thank you.